So I would disagree with Raghuram Rajan very strongly on this, because I think it doesn't recognize the new realities and it doesn't give due importance to the significance of extreme inequality in affecting economies, societies, politics, everything. He and many others oppose this is that they argue that this is a disincentive to entrepreneurship and investment, and so it kind of works against growth. That's nonsense. In fact, what this does is give us what Piketty has called patrimonial capitalism. It's people who basically live off inheritance and rent. They're not incentivized to actually do the productive investment. So that's why we find countries with very high inequality, like India, our investment rates are not going up. Our rich are getting richer and richer. Our large corporations are getting larger and larger. But we're not getting an aggregate increase in investment.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Professor Jayati Ghosh. Professor Ghosh is a development economist. She is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, USA. Her core ideas of study includes international economics and globalization, employment patterns in developing countries, macroeconomic policy, and gender and development. Professor Ghosh, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I wanted to kick off by asking you about your thoughts on a kind of growing literature on rise of Asia and rise of the global South in general. Jeffrey Sachs recently wrote a column highlighting how in the mid-90s, the share of the G7 was like about 45% of the global output, and it has declined to maybe 30%. And BRICS Plus has risen from maybe 19% to 33, 34%. I recently went through your column titled, Where Have All the Asian Tigers Gone?, where you analyze India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. And I want to juxtapose the two pictures, because the thing that I liked about your piece was that when you keep China out of the picture, the story becomes very, very modest. And the countries you picked were not necessarily the weaker Asian economies. These are like relatively in the mainstream notion are bright economies. And yet you show that investment is very, very modest. Capital account inflows doesn't translate into investment most often. Period of very high growth is very, very short-lived. So I just wanted to kick off by asking your thoughts on this emerging picture of global convergence between the global North and the South.
You've absolutely identified the issue, Jyotishman, which is really that it's China. And because China is so large and China's growth has been so rapid and so spectacular, it really completely changes the picture. So yes, there is absolutely no doubt about China's rise, and that does have implications for the rest of the world and the world economy. But you can't say that therefore all of Asia is rising. In fact, in terms of clear success stories, the only ones that come close, yes, Korea, but Korea is already in the developed country league, maybe Malaysia to a much lesser extent, and recently Vietnam, which is also growing very rapidly, but is still a middle-income country, very much so. So really it's China. So the tendency has been in the West, in the US and Europe particularly, to conflate China with all of Asia. And this is actually helped by China. China doesn't want to be seen as the big outlier. And so, yes, it does encourage, considering BRICS as a group, or considering the rest of G20 outside G7 as a group, or considering various other groupings to say that it's part of a broader movement of certain countries in the global South. But that's really not true. I think what's remarkable about China is that it has been able to insert itself into the global economy without experiencing the negatives that have come from it for other countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, India, and so on. It has managed to leverage its market access, which it had for maybe 15 years, into very dramatic export growth and built up reserves and built up economic strength that have enabled it now to spend hugely on new technologies, to encourage R&D investment, to continue massive increases in infrastructure. And because it is such a large economy, it gets all these economies of scale. So when it produces electric vehicles, it's already way ahead of everybody else, simply because it's producing millions of them, right? When it produces anything, it's ahead of everybody else because of these economies of scale.
I wanted to quickly ask you, for our viewers, kind of two groups that come to my mind when I think about the global south. And I'm thinking through in terms of the capital account, probably countries like India, Indonesia, Malaysia, which don't face balance of payment crisis. And yet the kind of capital inflows, there is a gap between capital inflows and, let's say, gross fixed capital formation. And then there is a set of countries which are reeling under sovereign debt crisis. So can you just elaborate these two different set of countries?
Yeah, you know what is so interesting to me? They are certainly different, but they both reflect the disadvantages of being inserted into an unequal global economy. Okay, so let's begin. I mean, with the countries facing debt stress, everybody knows, right? Everyone can see that they're in problems. Often it's blamed on the countries themselves that they spent wrongly, they borrowed too much to invest in areas they shouldn't have, or they used it in consumption or vanity projects. All of that is true. But how do you explain all of them facing this crisis together? It's really because they are faced with very, very unequal global capital markets, where when the West decides to have loose monetary policy after the global financial crisis, when they decide to massively increase liquidity, there's all this money sloshing around the globe and it's looking for outlets. And so suddenly, all these countries get access to financial markets, which they didn't have before. They could have floated bonds, nobody would buy them. Now suddenly, everyone's buying them. BlackRock is buying them, Morgan Stanley is buying them, and so on. When they get that access, yes, some of them goof up, some of them don't goof up. Maybe they invest in infrastructure, but nonetheless, that access is really dependent on these relative rates of return. So if there is any hint of a problem, so remember, they're getting access, but they're paying much higher interest rates already. They're paying, why? Because they're seen as riskier, right? If there is any problem, a pandemic, which we had, or a war that raises food and fuel prices, which we had, then these countries will face a bit more difficulty in their exports and getting foreign exchange. Immediately, you will find that these financial markets will actually turn on them. And if then these advanced economies raise interest rates, then it's a multiple whammy. Then immediately the capital goes back. So these countries are ending up in debt stress or debt crises, not necessarily because of their own mistakes, but because of what's going on in the policies of the rich countries. So that's one set of countries. The reason why we have more than 70 countries facing severe debt stress is because there's a global phenomenon, and that global phenomenon is internationally mobile capital responding to policies in the US and Europe. Okay, so that's the first set of countries. But then let's consider the second set. Now, these are supposedly the successful ones, right? Everybody thinks of India today as a success story. I could argue it's not, but certainly Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, these are all countries that are seen in Asia as dynamic, doing well. I would argue that even their insertion into global capital markets has not been to their advantage. So one is the point that you've made, which is absolutely crucial, that they're getting all this gross capital inflow, but that is not leading to higher investment rates. The only country where investment rates went up is Thailand, and that's because of government policies. In India, investment rates have been stagnant or falling for more than a decade. And similarly in Indonesia and in Malaysia. So it's not translating into more investment. But there's an even worse issue, which is you're getting all this inflow, but you're also getting outflows. Because you've opened your capital account, right? You've liberalized all these flows. And so you find pension funds in Malaysia, central bank reserves in all of these countries, they're all holding their money in safe assets. The safest one, of course, is US Treasury bills, but various assets in US and Europe. So what's happening here is what we would call a seigniorage loss. What does that mean? It means that the capital that is coming into your country is getting high rates of return because it's seen as riskier when you lend, or because, just interest rates are higher in our countries, right? So the capital that comes in gets a high rate of return. The capital that goes out, it goes to the US, which had very low interest rates for a very, very long time, close to zero, right? Or Europe as well. So it's getting very low interest. So that difference between the return you have to pay to people who invest in your country and the return you get from investing abroad, that difference can be a seigniorage gain or a seigniorage loss, okay? So the US makes a massive seigniorage gain. I haven't calculated how much, but it's definitely more than 3-4% of GDP. But countries in Asia have been facing significant seigniorage losses. There was one calculation by UNCTAD, which I have quoted in a paper that I did recently, which estimates that for India, for the decade after the global financial crisis till about 2021, it was 2.5% of GDP every year that we were losing just because of these rates of return. In Thailand, it's more than 5% of GDP. Can you imagine? Every year they're losing 5% of GDP in this interest rate differential. And that is more than all of the net capital inflow. So they're not really gaining at all. So the inequalities that are inherent in the global financial markets means that even the so-called successful countries are not really gaining from being engaged in them.
I think this is a good segue into a little bit of focus on the metropolis itself and talking about seigniorage gain. I was thinking about this talks about the US versus Europe lately in the Financial Times. And the broad picture is like the US economy is growing and the European economies are in recession, and labor markets is often blamed. But I was also thinking about the dominance of Fortune 500 companies in the US and how much of that is probably stimulating the US GDP on a comparative scale between Europe and the US. So what are your thoughts about this emerging picture that it's all negative and downhill in Europe and the US is somehow booming? It's the Financial Times and the CNN.
Yes, I would say it has nothing to do with labor markets. It's zero to do with labor markets. In fact, European labor markets have become so-called flexible significantly over the past 20 years. I would argue it is driven by fiscal policy differences. Okay? And here, the villain of the piece to me is Germany in Europe. Germany not only has an extraordinary obsession with fiscal discipline, but it imposes that on the rest of Europe. We saw that during the Eurozone crisis, how they really punished the countries in the European periphery for mistakes made by their own banks and by banks in the European core. But essentially what has happened is that, yes, there was some increase in spending during the pandemic in Europe, but very quickly the fiscal hawks got back into action. So by 2022, all of that was over. Yeah, and it was still very much an economy that is now devoted to restraining spending. In fact, a German journalist I was talking to yesterday was saying that people who have come to Germany for the Euro Cup, the Euro Football Cup is being held in Germany this year, are shocked because they have an image of Germany as incredibly developed, industrialized, efficient, and they're finding the infrastructure is collapsing, the trains don't run on time, the systems are not working because of underinvestment. Okay? The difference in the US is that it has actually been much more fiscally expansionary. So in the pandemic period, there was a massive increase. I think about 28% of GDP, additional government spending between January 2020 and March 2021, huge increase in government spending. And it sustained, it didn't shrink thereafter. So in other words, what has happened in the US is that the fiscal expansion has kept the US economy going and booming. Some of that, not enough, but some of that is being directed into productivity increasing and green investments. Some of that is going into infrastructure, again, desperately needed because a lot of that infrastructure is 100 years old. But it's much more than in Europe. So that's really the big difference between US and Europe. What's happening now, the trade war, is really because that fiscal expansion in the US is being combined with what can only be called protectionist policies.
I would ask you about the protectionist because there is a lot talked about now as if we are in a period like post-depression period of protectionism, and I wanted to have your thoughts about how much of that is true and how much of that is like China bashing. But on this point, I just wanted to comment like Gita Gopinath of the IMF recently warned the sort of unsustainability of US debt burden. And she did support some tax reforms, by which she means like rich Americans paying for aging populations, healthcare, and so on. But there are no talks about massive tax reforms. And today, the Financial Times reports the European Central Bank's admonishing France of having breached the sort of fiscal prudence, and also like 6 other economies. And they have their European Central Bank calculation is that all Eurozone economies should cut down its fiscal deficit or budgetary deficit by 5% of its GDP. Just your thoughts.
Ridiculous. But aside from being economically ridiculous, in other words, there is really no theoretical justification for this argument at all. There's no empirical justification for this argument at all, and I'll come to both of those. But I think the fact that these are so widespread, so continuing, and keep reappearing, the minute, in fact, there's any kind of minimal stability in an economy, is because of power. It's because these policies benefit only large capital that is interested in expanding its share of the pie, not necessarily expanding the pie, but grabbing market shares from smaller companies or other regions, okay? And so it's reflecting that power. These demands for fiscal retrenchment, what do they mean? It means if the public spends less, there's less healthcare, there's less something else, you'll have to approach a private provider. You will have to, basically it enables private capital to encroach into terrain that was earlier seen as a citizen's right, that, governments will make sure you get it, that will be provided. So that's why we get these arguments periodically. But let me first highlight why these are wrong arguments. In fact, really stupid arguments in a way, economically speaking. The argument that there is a particular level of public debt to GDP at which suddenly it becomes unsustainable, there is no analytical justification for it. Okay, there is really nothing, because it's all a question of perceptions. What is viable? Do you want an exploding debt to GDP ratio, which is going up by 5% every year? No, you don't want that, obviously. But if you want debt to GDP...
Sorry, just for our viewer, would you make a distinction between domestic debt and international debt here?
Well, I would make a distinction between domestic and international debt for countries that do not have global reserve currencies. Mm-hmm. So if you are an India or a Sri Lanka or Bolivia or an Argentina, you have to worry about external debt. Domestic debt, no, because if it is domestic debt held by domestic residents, you're fine, okay? However, if you are a global reserve currency holder, if you are the US, for example, what's the problem? You are the issuer of this currency. There is really no restriction. Mm-hmm. In fact, look at Japan. Japan has a public debt to GDP ratio of 240%, I think, at the moment. Right. There was a period when it was almost 300% of GDP. I mean, it really doesn't matter. Japanese citizens are okay holding Japanese bonds. What's the big problem? Yeah, it's not a threat to anything. And what makes a debt to GDP ratio of, say, 70% unsustainable, which is what Spain is being told, for example, if 240% is okay for Japan? What is it that makes it suddenly unsustainable? There is a different issue which has to do with whether you want an exploding public debt to GDP ratio, that is just going up crazily every year. No, you don't want that. And clearly you do want some, shall we say, medium-term kind of balance. And for that, yes, you have to raise revenues. But the problem here is that there is no discussion of the most obvious revenues to be raised. And there are two. One is a wealth tax on the super wealthy. I'm not even talking about regular wealth tax. I'm saying wealth tax on wealth above, let's say, $100 million. Centimillionaires only, in the rich countries. Just taxing 2% of that wealth. Gabriel Zucman has done a really good study, which it's generating $250 billion a year globally. So think of the kinds of revenues you're foregoing by not taxing wealth. Now, if you're holding 100 million, 2%, you will not notice it. It's like stock market fluctuations. Every year you have a change in valuation. It's no big deal. It's not something you will even bother about. It certainly won't affect your consumption, investment, or even your so-called philanthropy. But it will generate significant tax revenues. The other obvious thing to do is to make multinational companies pay the same rates that domestic companies pay. Now, at the moment, they don't. They can get away with paying almost zero rates because they shift their taxes to low tax, their profits to low tax jurisdictions. And they have all kinds of ways of doing it. You know, all the intellectual property rights, the patents, everything is held in some tax haven, Luxembourg, say, or Ireland, or wherever. And then they can simply say, no, we're getting lots of revenues from your country, but in fact, we have to pay all these other fees and surcharges and royalties. So we don't have any profits in your country. All our profits are in these tax havens. The simple way to deal with this, just to say this multinational company is one company. It's not hundreds of little companies in different countries. So it's not Apple India, Apple Spain, Apple Portugal, Apple Mozambique. It is Apple. And we will tax our share of Apple's profits at our corporate rate. Now, that's a fairly simple thing to do. It already happens within the United States. That's what states do. States look at the national profits of a company and they tax their share of the national profits according to the state's tax rate. In the US, it's already an existing system that has been there for decades. We are saying, I'm part of an independent commission on corporate taxation. We are saying we should treat multinational companies in the same way. Every country should be taxing its share of the profits according to a formula based on sales, employment, depending on maybe it's a mineral resource company, then, what kind of mineral it's extracting. Use a formula and tax your share of the global profits according to your domestic rate.
Just to be a little bit clear on this, do we need some sort of global tax enforcing mechanism? Because what I'm thinking is in Ireland, the tax rate may be very, very low, and Apple would say that, oh, everything is intellectual property right given to Ireland. So we have made nothing in the US. So even if the US charges that, it would be like next to nothing. So how do we do?
That's why we have said you need both. You need a global approach to this, and you need a global minimum tax rate. Now, this is something that actually got agreed in the OECD inclusive process for base erosion and profit shifting. Okay, they've been doing these negotiations for, I think, 9 years. Finally, last year, there was some kind of a compromise. So there was an agreement on these two pillars. Okay, but the agreement on minimum tax is only 15%. That is to say, if a company is saying, well, all our profits are made in Ireland, but Ireland is not taxing 15%, then you can say, no, well, we're taxing you the difference between whatever is Ireland's tax rate and the 15%. There's a global minimum tax rate. Now, 15% is too low because if you look at global corporate taxation rates, the median is 25%. Half the countries in the world have tax rates above that, and most of them are developing countries. So we're saying, no, it should be the median. It should be 25%. Because if you make it 15%, that's close to Ireland. Ireland is 12.5%. So you're really coming down to the tax haven level. And once you make it such a low rate, there is a danger that there will be a pressure on all these countries to say, well, make your corporate tax rate 15%. So basically, we need a higher global minimum tax rate for corporations. We need this global approach to unitary taxation of multinationals based on a formula. You apportion the profits. And we need a similar approach to wealth, that I should be able to tax your wealth wherever you hold it, if you are a taxpayer in my country. So Gabriel Zuckman, he is a member of our commission on tax. He has proposed this, which I think is, and we are supporting this, that there should be a global minimum tax rate of 2% on wealth, which is on either income or wealth. So that the very richest people, you will tax either their wealth or their income, so that they're ending up paying that 2%.
I wanted to quickly get away with one thing because I would have to give my team the moment of sensationalization. We had Raghuram Rajan on our show, and he challenged Piketty and his team, including you, on the empirical historical precedence of a successful wealth tax. So you have already explained the mechanisms and stuff, but he has challenged you, saying that it hasn't worked ever in human history. Your response?
Well, I think there are two responses I would give. I think the first is that the ways that wealth tax was implemented in the past, it applied to all wealth, which is really complicated. It's far too complicated to go around measuring everybody's wealth in all its different forms. We are saying it's a tax on extreme wealth. It's not a tax on, if I buy a flat somewhere that it's, mind you, most countries have got property taxes. And somehow nobody thinks that's complicated or impossible or has never worked. Everybody accepts property tax. It's much more complicated. Today, financial wealth is actually easy to identify because we are now enforcing that's one of the advantages of these international agreements. We now have country by country exchange of banking information. So a government tax authority can actually know who's holding what where, according to these banking exchange information. So we can actually calculate the financial wealth. Okay, maybe we don't know the value of the paintings they've bought and they're hiding somewhere. Maybe we don't know the final, who owns the yacht, etc. But if we demand that every country releases information on the beneficial owners of trusts, because one of the ways the rich hide their money is to put it into trusts. Mm-hmm. And so then you don't know who's actually the beneficiary, right? The person handling the trust is just your lawyer or accountant. But if, in fact, you're forced to reveal the beneficial owners, then we will know who owns how much wealth. And it's all computerized now, it's digitized. You can actually access that information quite easily. So in fact, it's not so impossible to actually calculate, and it's not impossible to actually tax it. There are countries like Colombia, which have recently brought in a tax on Colombian residents for their wealth wherever they hold it. And they're using information from the OECD about this banking. So where they're holding accounts in all these other countries, whether it's Switzerland or Mexico or wherever, they will get that information and you will be taxed on that wealth. So it is possible. The other point, I think, really is that in India, we used to hear this all the time. It will cost more to collect it than it will that if you... No, once again, it does not do that if you focus on the very rich. Because you're looking at only a very small subset and you're calculating the tax of the wealth and therefore the tax only for that very small subset. And because now so much more is digitized, it is possible to do this. It's not expensive in the same way at all to do this. It requires political will. The real reason I think, he and many others oppose this is that they argue that this is a disincentive to entrepreneurship and investment. And, so it kind of works against growth. That's nonsense. In fact, what this does is give us what Piketty has called patrimonial capitalism. It's people who basically live off inheritance and rent. They're not incentivized to actually do the productive investment. So that's why we find countries with very high inequality, like India, our investment rates are not going up. Mm-hmm. Our rich are getting richer and richer. Our large corporations are getting larger and larger. But we're not getting an aggregate increase in investment. So I would disagree with Raghuram Rajan very strongly on this, because I think it doesn't recognize the new realities and it doesn't give due importance to the significance of extreme inequality in affecting economies, societies, politics, everything. I do recall in that interview, he said, oh, you can just have a communist revolution. Right. I think that's a very, shall we say, it's a foolish response. It's positing anything that is not extreme, not just neoliberal, but extremely patrimonial and almost feudal kinds of ownership values. Anything that tries to reduce that is immediately branded as a communist revolution. I think that's very unfair.
I had one more question on this segment on wealth tax in particular. One of the things said about financial assets as opposed to, let's say, land and other forms of assets where market prices don't fluctuate very rapidly, is that it would be unfair to impose a massive tax on financial assets because market prices see very rapid fluctuation. So it's almost like you taxing me like 30% out of my financial assets, while the risk being so high, and next day I can lose like 50% because of market fluctuation, and that would leave the capital markets in a sort of mess. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, remember it's a very low tax. It's not 30%, it's 2%, which is really trivial, right? It's way below any market fluctuation. And second, that's easy to deal with. You can make it an average of the last 2 years or last 3 years. Yeah, I mean, that's really not an insuperable problem at all. Yes, markets fluctuate, but if they're on a broad trend, then an average of the previous 2 or 3 financial years should be more than enough to actually compensate.
One final question on the fiscal concerns about fiscal activism. The Financial Times and others constantly say that the kind of public financing of now increasing defense, but aging population from Europe, you have to rely on private financing. And the moment fiscal expenditure increases, it sort of hurts market, and that essentially traps you in this very problematic financing of all these services that you need. What's your response to that?
That is such a self-interested response from the City of London, if I may say so. It's really finance saying you allow us free reign over everything. We know that private investment doesn't finance old age because there's no profits in it. We know that most private investment is not going to finance sustainable development goals. Again, there's no profit in it. We know that achieving health for all, you have to have public spending because most of this is not necessarily profitable. I mean, let's be clear. All that investment in vaccines in the pandemic, entirely financed by governments. It was governments that financed the R&D. It was governments that gave the subsidies to the corporations. It was governments that then bought the vaccines. Mm-hmm. So this whole notion that, private sector will do it in the market.
Green technology is another sector that is flagged, and you have been thinking about this issue.
Absolutely. Again, with technology, I mean, look at the way we mismanaged the entire vaccine issue during the COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, we gave, or rather governments gave free rein, and fine, it was an urgent emergency and so on, to private companies, providing them with entire financing that was required for producing these vaccines. Then it actually, having done that, paid for the whole thing, said, okay, now it's yours. You can do what you like with it. You can charge what you like. We will not put any limits or conditions. We will not even ask you to share the technology that we paid for. Now, that is obscene. Can you see, for example, a venture capitalist saying, well, I'll put all this money, and then the minute it makes profits, I'm going to walk away and let you have it? So why are governments giving away to large pharma companies all the rights to something which they did? I mean, AstraZeneca did not even develop that vaccine. It was developed in an Oxford University lab with public money. Okay, the mRNA vaccines, 90% of that came from public labs done by scientists working in public institutions. The last little bit of research that was required was entirely subsidized, okay, by the German government in the case of the Pfizer vaccine, and by the US government in the case of Moderna. Once those vaccines, then the testing was again, subsidized by the governments. Then the approvals were fast-tracked by the governments. Then the liability was removed by the governments so that they didn't have to worry in case there was any bad fallout of the vaccine. All of that liability was taken care of. Every risk taken care of, every cost taken care of. Then they get complete control over the technology. They don't have to share it. They can demand higher and higher prices, which they did. So they're charging the same government double for the booster after the government has paid for everything. And they're refusing to share it with other companies in the developing world who need that vaccine badly. So how do we allow this kind of obscene privatization of knowledge, which has been in fact paid for through public money, through taxpayer money?
I think a good way to wrap up sort of this segment is a theoretical question about rentier capitalism, techno-feudalism. There is a burgeoning literature. I think this emerged in the 1970s, but now it's getting new traction, and a lot of people are writing it. We are hosting Brett Christophers, who also wrote a book on rentier capitalism next week. Do you find this literature helpful, or the category helpful, of rentier capitalism? One of my I agree with most of it. One of my problems is that it kind of sometimes deliberately, sometimes tacitly, it gives an impression that capitalism in general is very productive, and it's this sort of a bastardization of capitalism, which is the rentier capitalism, which is something, while not sometimes taking into account that finance and production are sort of interlinked spheres. And I was having Arrighi in my mind, but your response?
I have a lot of sympathy with the approach of rentier capitalism, or even techno-feudalism, in the sense that Varoufakis, for example, Yanis Varoufakis has written about quite a bit. But I won't say that this necessarily means earlier capitalism was all wonderful and excellent and it's just become bad now or anything. No, but there's no doubt that this is a different phase. And it's a different phase. Why? Because when I'm talking about rents, I'm not just talking about finance. I'm not just talking about landed property. I'm talking about the extraction that is made from control over markets. So, for example, what I just talked about, intellectual property, the rents from intellectual property are entirely because of market domination, and they are not productive at all in that sense. So, this idea that you need those rents to generate more investment, no. Next time there's a pandemic, you bet anything that these companies will once again go to the government and say, we're not doing anything till you give us a big subsidy to actually invest in that particular process or whatever. So I would argue that the problem now is we have enabled massive market dominance of large corporations, and there are certain sectors where it matters the most. Certainly finance, certainly pharma, it's very big, and IT. Right. Information technology very broadly. I would argue these three are the ones where the control of large companies is so large that it is able to influence regulation, it is able to influence fiscal policies, tax policies, all of those things. It is able to influence trade policies, and it is therefore able to influence our ability to do anything as humanity, to meet our planetary challenges, to meet our social, political challenges, to deliver any kind of economic justice. So basically, we've allowed these Frankenstein monsters to grow. And now they've grown so big, they can control our governments. Mm-hmm. And we have to do something if we actually want to survive, I would say, as a species on this planet.
And the profits are mostly coming from them. I mean, one estimate that I read was like, if you club energy sector with it, like 75% of the profits are coming from these 3 sectors or 4 sectors. And like traditional capitalist sectors like minerals, mines, or maybe not mines, but chemicals, fertilizers, metals, they're like 1% of the profit, or even below. I think, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this concern about a new era of protectionism. And I wanted to respond to it because obviously the Inflation Reduction Act and a whole range of security-related alibi being whipped up both in Europe and the US against Chinese green technology and so on and so forth is the context. Um, I'm a little bit reluctant about this new age because on the capital flow, we are not seeing a lot of talks about capital controls. And I'm not even sure if the WTO heralded a sort of new age of free market for goods and services in the sense that economists tell us. So your response.
Well, I'm not a big believer in free markets because I think all these markets are hugely influenced by the socio-political context and by laws and regulations. So there has never been, in that sense, a really free market, right? But it is certainly true that the period after the 1990s involved a much greater reduction of trade barriers, the traditional kinds of trade barriers, yeah, and especially in the developing world. Mm-hmm. Also in the developed world. Okay, so yes, I mean, the WTO did play a role in bringing down a whole range of the regulatory barriers to trade. Was that always a good thing? No, because in fact, it did assist in the deindustrialization of many countries or the stalled industrialization of many others. And the rise of China, which is kind of coterminous, really meant that that developing countries were squeezed out of that whole competitive thing. They could not export as much as they could have otherwise, and their own imports were affected, or their own domestic production was affected by cheap Chinese imports, and all of that. Yes, for sure. What's happening today is so interesting because here you have the developing world still being told that no, you must continue with this free trade and this comparative advantage, and you must only go for the kinds of things that you have comparative advantage in, if it is agriculture or minerals or low grade, manufactured goods and so on. But the rich countries are opting out. And the rich countries are opting out because they have suddenly realized that China, which did not play by those rules, China has actually managed to achieve significant levels of industrialization. And because of the economies of scale, it's just cheaper in everything. I keep emphasizing economies of scale. I think we underestimate how important it has been for China because it had such a large domestic market that it is able to actually get massive. It goes way down on that long run cost curve very quickly. And so really, it's very hard for even the rich countries to compete with that. So the US and European response is really a response which is, I would argue, it's more a fear of technology than of trade. There's still, by the way, the US is still importing huge quantities from China. I don't think it's come down despite, I mean, it's a little bit come down, but not as much, right? Europeans are certainly importing just as much from China, but there is a real fear that they will achieve preeminence in technology, and especially the technologies of the future in AI and in green technologies. I think that's already the case. I mean, they are certainly far ahead in 5G, despite the attempts to smother Huawei. They're certainly ahead in electric vehicles and in batteries and all of those things. Now they're moving into sodium-ion batteries, which the West hasn't even thought about yet. They are certainly ahead in access to all the rare earths and minerals and lithium and stuff that is required for the greening of the technologies. And let's face it, the reason why wind and solar power are competitive today globally is because of China. There's no question. We have to accept that, and we should be grateful for that. But yes, that is what the West fears. They fear the technology dominance.
A lot is talked about the subsidies under the WTO basket, particularly with Chinese subsidies. But this has been an issue going on between developed and developing nations. What's your take on that?
I mean, all these countries have been subsidizing all along. And in fact, what is the IRA? It's an attempt to copy China. It's really a desperate and rather, I would say, unsuccessful attempt to copy the Chinese pattern. Because the Chinese pattern has been to subsidize, but to create big competition between players in that sector. And the IRA is just basically looking at that playbook and saying, let's try and do the same thing. So for them to critique China on this is massively hypocritical. Imitation is the best and most sincere form of flattery.
Yes, one of the growing literature within the Chinese scholarship is about how these local governments in China created this condition of a very competitive space for different businesses, and local governments' revenue was also dependent on them. So it's after the financial decentralization, that's a kind of very, very sort of hyper competitive social Darwinian kind of business markets prevailed. I um, I wanted to ask you a slightly different topic, but since you have written so much about it, which is on the female labor participation, female participation in the labor force, particularly in the global south, because this is something when we look, I mean, I have been thinking about the global south, and I try to sort of earmark different things about what makes the global south a global south. And one of the striking thing is exclusion of women from the labor force and overrepresentation within the unpaid work. So if you can tell us what is this link between low labor force participation of women in the global south and being global south itself? Why is it so essential to being global south?
Well, it's not cultural alone. Okay, I think that we have to first clarify that it's not just about, people in the global south having a particularly worse patriarchal attitude. I mean, in some countries that is the case, but it's not the only reason. It really has to do with the whole process of development itself. So countries in the global north did go through what could be a more kind of standard Kuznets-Lewis-Clark kind of process whereby you get people moving from agriculture to industry to services, you get a more formal workforce, you get more women engaged in the workforce, and so on. But there is this critical aspect of the economy, which we never talk about really, and which is fundamental, and that is care work. So you see, the thing about care work is that in traditional societies, pre-capitalist societies for sure, most work was not in that sense marketed. So when women did care work within households, it was like men doing agricultural work or whatever other work they did. And it was part of the same thing. With capitalism, you get the emergence of marketed labor. And then the sexual division of labor within households becomes even more significant for capitalism because it relies on that social reproduction within families to enable the workers to go out there and be the workers and sell their labor power and all of that. Now, in the developing world, we find that there is this extraordinary mix whereby that traditional pattern persists with extreme capitalism in the labor force. But that really means that the development process relies on this unpaid worker women. India, my own country, for example, is absolutely the classic textbook example of this, whereby growth relies hugely on this. I mean, the growth is, if you like, a little film on top of the sea, and that sea is unpaid labor. So if you look at the paid workforce, only 13% of women above the age of 15, only 13% get paid for work that they do. It's unbelievable, right? These are levels equivalent to Saudi Arabia and so on. But does that mean all these other women are not working? No. In fact, if you look at all the other kinds of work that women do, care work within the households, kitchen gardening, looking after fetching water, fetching fuel wood, doing all tutoring children, making clothes, etc., all of those things, then about 88% of women are working. So that huge gap between 88 and 13%, that's the sea of unpaid labor, which is contributing to the economy and which is essential for the economy. Now, this has many implications, and I've talked about India, but you can generalize this everywhere. Where there are more and more women engaged in unpaid work, it means that when women do enter the paid workforce, their work is not valued because they can work for free. So in a sense, their opportunity cost is very, very low. So you will find very high gender wage gaps. Wherever there are more women doing unpaid work or less women in paid employment, you will find higher gender wage gaps. Okay. The second thing you will find is that they will be clustered into occupations that are similar to what they're doing in unpaid fashion. The care kinds of sectors, there will be nurses or domestic workers or early childhood teachers or, that kind of
This is a
activity.
segregation of the labor market instantly.
Occupational segregation. Yeah. And then you find that there's a wage penalty even for the men who work in that. So in fact, those occupations then become the low paid occupations. So if there are more women working in a manufacturing type of work, let's say bidi rolling, those basic cigarettes that are made in India, anybody working in that gets low wages. Women again work heavily in the brick kiln industry. Men working there also get very low wages. So there's the wage penalty that extends to anything where there are more women participating. And then, of course, all of this, and this, by the way, it's not just private employment. Public employment does this too. So you will find there are different grades of nurses or care workers, etc., even in public employment, and not just in India, in South Africa, in Brazil, everywhere. So even the government sector and public employment exploits this particular gender division of labor. And finally, this is a huge subsidy to what we can call the recognized economy. And because nobody mentions it, because it's completely ignored by economists and by public policy, it's taken for granted. But this really means that governments can use this as a cushion. So why do we get fiscal retrenchment as a basic demand all the time? And when it is fiscal retrenchment, why does it immediately hit on all of these care sectors first? On all of the health and other care and other, because you know that it's going to happen anyway. You can rely on unpaid labor being delivered to make up for the slack. So that's why I argue it is not gender blind. These are gender exploitative policies. These are macroeconomic policies that recognize that certain kinds of work are going to be done anyway. So we don't have to really make sure that they are delivered.
I was wondering, one particular sector that you didn't mention was the existence of small peasant agriculture, because women, I mean, it's not just care work that women do. Large sections of unpaid work is actually supporting agriculture. In some villages directly, in other villages like indirectly, like carrying food and water. And in many villages, they actually do the work. So does that also have a link at the larger share of agriculture?
Very much so. The share of agriculture is, for example, in India, we know that our own labor force data tell us that 37% of women who are called employed are actually unpaid helpers in family enterprises. Most of that is in agriculture, but some of that is also, in a shop or something, you sit in the shop in the daytime or whatever. So unpaid helpers are more than 1/3 of the women who are called employed. And a very large part of it is in agriculture. But you see, here's the funny thing. If you actually go out and, let's say, help in the rice transplantation or in some other weeding or something, then you are an unpaid helper in the family enterprise. If you just go and bring food and water to those who are working in the field, then you're not. Then you're not in the labor force. So it's a very peculiar and I would say male distinction that is made in terms of the kind of work. If you are feeding the buffaloes in your home and making sure that they are tended, doing, looking after chicken, whatever, you're not in the labor force. So there are all these peculiar distinctions that are made, yet all of these are economic activities. So unfortunately, the way that we still rely on a system of national accounts that was developed in a very different period and for very different reasons, for war economies, we're still relying on that framing to understand our economies. And that's a mistake because then we miss out all of these very important linkages
A lot has been going on about industrialization versus service sector insofar as the potential path for the global south is concerned. We had Professor CP Chandrasekhar, your colleague, and and then the other key element is also the climate change and green economy. And we asked him, and he said very frankly that obviously industrialization doesn't have to be very polluting. We can have green industrialization. But he was very frank in saying that he sees no way to break out of the large informalization of the workforce without having some significant share of the industrial workforce. Professor Rajan and others, on the other hand, says no, there is a service sector way. And the irony is like there is a top high-end service sector, like which has become now exportable, but within the low-end service sector, it's almost like saying Indian poor or global South poor would become very rich within a generation by selling services like massages and haircuts to lower middle class. So, what's your response to that?
I personally think that we must industrialize, that you cannot avoid it or skip it or, leapfrog it in a way that an earlier government in India did think. Why must we industrialize? Because manufacturing is more important than just employment. Manufacturing creates synergies, it creates knowledge, it creates technologies, and it's very important if you want to raise aggregate productivity in an economy. So I definitely think you cannot ignore manufacturing, and you must encourage it, especially for small and medium enterprises. Our problem is we focus only on the big. I know I talked about economies of scale, but that comes from a large domestic market. It doesn't come from necessarily the size of the company. But I don't think we should see manufacturing as the employment solution. We know it's not. It's not. I mean, technology has moved. Manufacturing is not going to give you more jobs. Certainly not the kind of jobs we need in our countries, huge shifts of population into manufacturing. No, it's not going to happen. So yes, we do need services, but not necessarily market-driven services of the kind that Raghuram Rajan is talking about. We need public services. At the moment, we are under-providing basic
What do you
services.
mean by public services?
I mean health, education, nutrition, okay, sanitation, the entire range of things that make for a better quality of life. And one way of guessing or assessing how much we provide these services is to just look at the share of employees, public employees per population. Okay. In the Scandinavian countries, which provide a reasonable level of public services, it's about 7%. So 7 per 100 people are public employees per population. In Europe as a whole, it's 5.5 per 100. In the US, which is worse, but it's still 4 or just above 4. In India, it's less than 2. It's like 1.4 or something. I forget the exact number, but we are way below. We are under-providing. Mm-hmm. In African countries, it's 1. So we are under-providing basic public services. And that means everything. It means you feel less safe when you're on the street. It means you have less women who are manning police stations. It means you have less shelters for those who are rendered homeless for any reason. You have less therapy for those who need it in periods of stress. You have less basic healthcare, etc., etc., etc. You have less teachers per student. You have, we are under-providing everything. And this is a huge employment generator, not only directly. Of course, if it would mean doubling, tripling, quadrupling the number of such workers that we have. But all of that has positive multiplier effects. You employ more teachers, health workers, sanitation workers, etc. They have money to spend, and they will go and spend it on local services. So that's, if you like, the sort of bubbling up of the economy rather than the trickle down. So I would really emphasize public employment, especially in the care services. But let's also think, what are the other industries of the future? I would say it's the care and the creative sectors. These are the industries of the future. You are not going to get employment in manufacturing. We need manufacturing. I emphasize, we cannot say we won't do manufacturing. We need manufacturing. But we shouldn't be looking for employment there. We should be looking for employment in the care and creative sectors.
I want to leave you with this final question on a broad reflection on the discipline of economics, since it's a rare privilege to have an economist like you, and I'm also a student of economics, and I read it all the time, although I never went to like economics department.
Mhm.
Um, and I have been thinking a little bit about as the centrality of growth within the discipline. I mean, my reading is that even within Keynesian economics, growth was always at the one of the centerpieces. I mean, in Keynes general theory, definitely. I mean, he was writing a little bit about, he hated the speculators in the capital markets, but he was largely concerned about reducing liquidity preference, driving down interest rates and stuff. Neoclassical economics is all about growth. Um, of course, development economics came in and it kind of brought our attention to human capital, standard of living, and stuff like that. But I still think growth is something which the discipline has unable to do away with. And since you have been thinking so much about ecology, about sustainability, and so on and so forth, tell us about where the discipline stands today and how do you see the discipline responding to some of the fundamental challenges that human beings face today, whether it's ecology or war, and so on.
Well, I think the mainstream discipline is hopeless on this. Let's be clear. I mean, it really doesn't have answers, but it doesn't even ask the questions, I would argue. Or it's answering the questions by tinkering around the edges. Let's manipulate. Let's do a little bit of blended finance. Let's do a little bit of public-private partnership and so on. So I think the mainstream discipline is out of it's not relevant really for these challenges. But I would argue that even within the left, we are a little behind in terms of not getting our act together in how we view the economy and how we're going to approach this problem. So, despite our best efforts, we still contain this whole reliance on GDP as a measure. I mean, we all recognize that it's flawed. We recognize that it includes lots of things which are not good, whether it is, excessive financial profits or weapons of mass destruction or whatever. We recognize it leaves out a lot of the good stuff, like the care economy and so on. Yet we keep using GDP. And that's a problem because then we get into, to my mind, meaningless debates like whether you should have degrowth or green growth. Okay? To me, they're meaningless. Why are they meaningless? Because we're still making that the objective function, the growth part. Now, if you think GDP is a terrible measure, why should we care whether it goes up or down? That's because we are still saying that the economy, the definition of the economy is really its GDP. I would argue, no, we have to think of it all the other way. Instead of saying, how can everything we do contribute to GDP? We should be thinking, what kind of economy do we need to get the society we want? Let's say we want a society that has health for all, access to education for all, human capabilities in this sense, and is in harmony with the planet and nature. So that's the society we want. Now, what's the economy we need to get there? How do we organize that economy? How do we encourage private investment to operate on those lines? What kinds of public investment do we need to make sure this happens? What's the regulatory framework we need? What's the urban planning framework we need? What's the transport framework we need, etc. So let's think of those. Now, if you look at it that way, it turns out that proposals from the green growthers and the degrowthers are identical. They're saying the same things. We are all saying the same kinds of policies that need to be implemented. But then we are fighting mindlessly about whether it's going to lead to a reduction or an increase in GDP. I think that's really, we have to get out of that mindset and we just focus on what are the policies we want.
Professor Ghosh, thank you very much. It was an incredible pleasure to have you again.
It was a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for your very thoughtful questions.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
You
Hi,
too.
my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content, so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.